Our first numbers we'd like to present to you involve what we call the Obama bounce. As many of you know, there had been a decline in support for the United States and for the U.S. president in Europe, a dramatic decline, in fact, in many countries, since about 2003, since the Iraq War. This decline has ended. There has been a dramatic improvement in public support for the U.S. president, for President Obama in Europe, and this is having a buoying effect on attitudes towards U.S. leadership, attitudes towards the United States. Yet there are still some troubling indicators in the data that suggest that this honeymoon may be short-lived, that it will not last forever, and certainly given the very high level of support for President Obama in Europe, it would be unreasonable to expect that high level could continue forever. So again, let's go to the numbers. Support for President Bush at the end of his term in 2008 was quite low in Europe. Only 12% of Germans approved of his handling of international affairs. Only 17% of the British supported the president's international policies. And even among those countries such as Romania and Poland, where 44% of the public supported President Bush's foreign policy, it was still below half the population and quite low by historic standards. In 2009, support for President Obama is quite a different story. Support in Germany has increased 80 percentage points. It has increased in France by 77 percentage points. There are a number of lessons to draw from this data. One is that the bounce is record proportion. We have never seen in the Transatlantic Trends survey such a change in data from one year to the next. Second, there is relatively less support for President Obama in Central and Eastern Europe than there is in Western Europe, which is a trend that bears watching and has an impact on future data we'll talk about. And finally, it is interesting that support for President Obama's foreign policy is much higher, for example, in France than it is in the United States. It's higher in Portugal than it is in the United States. In fact, in most of Europe, people are more supportive of President Obama's foreign policy than are Americans. Since 2002, we have been asking Europeans about their approval of the American president, in that case, President Bush, and his handling of international policies. As you can see from this data, that approval has trended downward, and since about 2004, only about 1 in 5 Europeans have been supportive of the American president. In an interesting parallelism, there's been a decline in Europe in the desirability of U.S. leadership that tracked very neatly the decline in support for the American president's handling of foreign policy. People were more supportive of U.S. leadership than they were of the U.S. president, but still there had been a halving of European support, the desirability of U.S. leadership. This changed dramatically in 2009. As you can see, support for the American president, now President Obama, dramatically increased, almost quadrupled. This tended to pull up European support for the desirability of U.S. leadership, and now about half of Europeans support U.S. leadership in the world. It is also useful to note, however, that that support has not returned to the very high levels that existed in 2002. It's headed in that direction, but it has not returned there yet. We ask people a series of questions about their confidence in President Obama and his handling of various international challenges. People's highest priority on both sides of the Atlantic was doing something about the economic crisis. And Europeans and Americans both had great confidence in President Obama's ability to manage international economic problems. The second greatest concern people had in our survey was over fighting international terrorism. Here there's a real distinction between European and American attitudes. Europeans, overwhelmingly, 3/4 of Europeans, are confident in President Obama's ability to deal with international terrorism. Less than half of Americans have that confidence. Finally, we asked people about working to ease tensions in the Middle East. Strong majorities on both sides of the Atlantic have confidence in President Obama's ability in this area, but it is also noteworthy that Europeans are more confident than are Americans. We also see that the Obama effect seems to have increased European interest in working with the U.S. and decreased European interest in being independent of the U.S. In 2005 and 2006, over half of Europeans said they thought that the European Union should take a more independent approach from the United States. That number began to decline in the last year of the Bush administration, and now it is about even in terms of support among those Europeans who say we should become closer with the United States. So you see an increase in interest in working with the U.S. and a decrease in European interest in being independent of the U.S. NATO is the cornerstone of the transatlantic alliance, and we have, since 2002, been asking people whether they thought that NATO was essential. Support for NATO in the United Kingdom actually declined between 2002 and 2006, and thanks to many of the efforts of the Bush administration to breathe new life into the transatlantic relationship, support for NATO began to increase in 2006 and has continued to increase under President Obama for the United Kingdom. We also see an increase in Germany, the red line on your screen. A dramatic drop-off in support for NATO through 2007 in Germany, but a steady increase beginning in the last year of the Bush administration, continuing in the first year of the Obama administration. The dotted green line shows support for NATO in France. What's interesting about this data is that support had increased in 2008 and then dropped off again in 2009. There are no easy explanations for this drop-off. Part of it may have to do with the debate going on in France about formally rejoining all of the NATO operations. It may have to do with reluctance to be more deeply engaged in Afghanistan, which is now NATO's principal mission. But at any rate, it is really one of the few indicators in our survey where support for an American-related international initiative has declined in France, because the French have generally shown an increase in support, which we relate to their support for Obama. Finally, in terms of attitudes towards NATO, we can see from these two lines that trace attitudes in Poland and Slovakia that support had dropped off in both of these countries for NATO and has begun to bounce back a bit. But what's interesting is that throughout this entire period since 2002, generally support for NATO has been lower in Central and Eastern Europe than it is in Western Europe. In 2008, Transatlantic Trends asked Europeans who they wanted to see be the next president of the United States. Overwhelmingly, people said they wanted Obama to win. We then asked those people, did they think if Obama won, would U.S.-European relations improve or not improve? Very strongly, most people, at least in Western Europe, thought that an Obama victory would translate into better transatlantic relations. Note in this chart, however, that people in Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and also in Turkey, were much less optimistic about things improving in an Obama administration. Then this year we asked people, now that President Obama is in office, did they think that relations had improved? What's interesting is that generally people think relations have improved, but their experience of the last 6 months does not live up to their expectations a year ago. So already we're beginning to see that people are not quite seeing what they expected from an Obama administration. One might argue that that was unrealistically high in terms of their expectations. Nevertheless, there is certain disappointment here. It's also interesting to note that in Central and Eastern Europe, people's expectations were not as high, and as a result, the difference between their expectations and their experience is negligible, and in a number of cases, in fact, their experience is slightly better than their expectations, which is another divide in European opinion that bears watching.